Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we want to have a look and we want to compare and contrast two different military operations. First, we want to look at the differences in terms of doctrine-based differences, and then ultimately the success of these two very different operations that took place. One, the attempted and then eventually Russian seizure of Hostomel Airport. At the same time, we are looking at the recent American military operation to seize Nicolas Maduro. Now, what is happening? Well, even in Russian military blogosphere circles, we are seeing some Russian bloggers talking about, hey, let's hire American generals. American generals could come in, former American generals, and essentially that would have changed the outcome of some of these engagements that specifically we have seen in the Ukraine. But it's much, much deeper and nuanced than that. Much more so. You are looking at, in terms of, if you compare and contrast the Russian military with the military of the United States, two completely different militaries in terms of doctrine-based, both technology and tactics, strategies, and more importantly, funding. Funding is incredibly important, but let's pause there for a second. Now, the battle of and the attempted seizure of Hostomel Airport. This area was just to the north by northwest of Kiev. Now, in the early days of the Russian operation to seize control of the Ukraine, one of the main targets for Russian forces was Hostomel Airport. That was an incredibly difficult operation for the Russians that ultimately was not very successful. Now, you will hear some folks say, well, this was a diversionary attack. This wasn't really designed to seize Kiev. Well, I don't agree with that. I believe, we can debate this, that it was the Russian intent to seize Kiev. Now, obviously, as the days and weeks of the war progressed, that strategy changed for the Russians. It just wasn't something that was going to become feasible for the Russians to take control of Kiev. Now, essentially, in the early hours of the Russian military operation, the initial phases of the attack on Hostomel Airport was done by helicopter-borne assault troops from what appears to be a hodgepodge of airborne VDV air assault troops. Now, what's interesting, we do have pictures of the Russian military units as they were flying into Hostomel. Now, as with anything, a picture tells you a lot. Now, if you're in an American modern military unit, dating back to even 2022 and even many, many years before that, and you look at this photograph of these Russian assault troops that are inside what I would assume to be an Mi-17 helicopter, that is on the way to Hostomel Airport. What do you see here? Some very interesting items that may or may not be missing that you would ordinarily see on an American combat kit. And that is in part to funding. Obviously, this unit that is on its way to Hostomel was not as well equipped as you would see in a modern U.S. military unit, or for that matter, a British military unit. A British or an American military unit of that caliber. Now look, the types of units that would have been used to seize control of Hostomel Airport would not have been, in all likelihood, Tier 1 Delta Force operators, the likes of which we observed take control and seize control of Maduro. They would have been members of either the Ranger Regiment, quite possibly Pathfinder units of the 82nd Airborne, could have been even possibly Marine Raiders. Difficult to say at this point, but they would not have been of the caliber of the Naval Development Group or the Delta Force to seize control of Hostomel Airport. A little bit different, or quite a bit of a different mission set. Initially, again, you're looking at specialty troops to come in, seize control of the airfield, and ultimately bring in more specialty troops, and ultimately armored units and motorized infantry units to mass in this area and have the ability to bring in, via aircraft and heavy lift aircraft, thousands of more airborne assault troops, along with their armored vehicles. The Russians have that capability. But they weren't able to do it. Again, that initial assault was driven off by successful Ukrainian counterattacks in terms of both artillery and infantry and armored units that were brought in to cause that initial Russian airborne assault unit to essentially flee the airport area and operate on the airport outskirts, the town and the urbanized areas around the airport. Ultimately, the Russians had to wait for motorized rifle units and airborne units, armored airborne units, to maneuver from Belarus down to Hostomel Airport. And that took some time. And it gave the Ukrainians the ability to essentially hammer the airfield with artillery, making it unusable for Russian forces. And we have video footage, we have pictures of what happened in the area of Hostomel and Hostomel Airport. You can see here, I believe these are BMD-4s that came under withering fire from Ukrainian forces. And again, what you're looking at here is a turret of a BMD-4. You can see the 100 millimeter gun, and then to the right of the main gun, if you're looking down the main gun, it's a 30 millimeter autocannon. And what remains of this turret? Again, very lightly armored vehicles fighting in a high intensity combat. Would you want to use these systems in this sort of combat? Maybe if you had the ability to suppress enemy ground forces with adequate air systems using modern targeting pods and assisted with drone systems that also had the ability to launch advanced weapon systems upon ground targets, it may have been successful. it may have been successful. Go move on here, look at some more pictures. Again, more BMD-4s. You can clearly see this is the turret of a destroyed tank. These vehicles were just ripped apart. I believe the Russians lost approximately 16 BMD-4s in the attack on Hostomel in the airport in those early hours of that operation. And you can see these vehicles were just completely destroyed, sitting there just to the right of the airfield. Again, this is Ukrainian artillery fire, anti-tank guided weapon systems. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the Ukrainians were still operating on the airport or very close to the airport. Not only that, they were able to bring artillery assets from regular Army units and National Guard units to then accurately shell Russian forces that had positioned themselves and had attempted to take control of the airport. You can see the massive damage in terms of artillery strikes. And in some cases, this may have been Russian airstrikes as well. This was a very high-intensity battle that took place. Now, how would the American Army gone about taking Hostomel Airport? Well, the big difference that you will see in terms of this Russian assault versus an American operation would have been based on real-time sensor information, having the ability to have a multitude of aerial combat platforms operating near and around Hostomel Airport. At the same time, having the ability to suppress and destroy Ukrainian air defense systems. It wasn't so much that it was Ukrainian air defense systems that prevented a successful Russian seizure of an intact airfield. Make no mistake, the Russians seized control of Hostomel Airport. But the military goal for the Russians was to seize the airport and then have the ability to fly in follow-on forces. They weren't able to do that because the Russians did not have the ability, or it was a failure of Russian forces on the component of the Russian forces that was designed to destroy the Ukrainian units around Hostomel Airport, specifically artillery systems. Deny the Ukrainians the ability to shell Hostomel Airport. Now, would this have turned out differently if this was the United States, if this was an American operation to seize control of Hostomel Airport? Yes, it would have turned out differently. The attack would have looked different. The weapon systems that were being used would have looked very different as well. And part of what you're seeing in terms of the differences in combat capability and power, you have to go back to the 1990s. You really do. If you go back to 1990, 91, kind of going into 89, the Soviet Union was essentially bankrupt. Its ability, and not only its ability, but its desire to adapt and take on certain Western-based doctrines was something the Russians were not, or the Soviets were not willing to do. Right? We see that. We see that in the development of targeting pods. We see that in the development of essentially computer-based systems. Whereas the United States had the financial ability to embrace these systems, the Soviets and eventually the Russians did not. Not only that, going from the early 90s all the way to essentially the early 2000s. I mean, you're looking at a good decade in which Soviet/Russian research and development was stalled for the better part of a decade. And you see that in earlier Russian operations. If we go back to the Russian operation to counter the Georgian military operation against South Ossetia in Abkhazia. Many folks call this a Russian invasion of Georgia. That is not what occurred. Eventually, Russian troops entered Georgia in response to what the Georgians were doing in South Ossetia. But I can tell you, as analysts watched what was happening on the ground back in 2008, I believe it was, 2008, we were looking at just some really crucial faults in the Russian way of war, especially the way it was operating in Georgia. Not only that, going back to the Chechen campaigns were just brutal assessments in what is essentially a stagnation in the development of doctrine, in the embracing of technology and having essentially the finances to embrace that technology. But even as we fast forward into 2022, in the hours of the war against the Ukraine, we were seeing and still see Russian strike aircraft that do not use advanced targeting pods in any sort of scale, right? We weren't seeing the use of the type of drones, if you compare and contrast Russian drones to the drones you would see in being utilized by the United States. Completely different technology. If you look at the definition, the high-definition thermal imaging optics that are used by the United States, and you compare and contrast the weapon systems in terms of optics that are being used by the Russians, they're not on the same level at all. Now, again, that goes back to that better part of a decade where research and development, and not only that, you have to look at doctrine as well. Look, the Russian military, and predating that, the Soviet military, was designed to fight what you would classify as a mega war, a large-scale World War III type of armored conflict. That's the way the Russians were built. Now, what would that have looked like against the West? Well, we'll never really know at this point. It never happened, and the Soviet military fell apart. Russian/Soviet manufacturing essentially fell apart. And again, we went through a decade in which R&D, research and development of the Russian military machine was greatly lacking, especially when you compare and contrast what the United States was doing in terms of research and development. Way ahead of the Russians. Way ahead. Now, that manifests itself in these sorts of operations. These operations where you're going to seize a high-value target and or an airfield, a well-protected enemy location behind enemy lines using high-quality forces with high technology as a mitigator to operating behind enemy lines. The Russians didn't have that. The Russians didn't have it. And to some extent, even now, the Russians don't have that capability. Not on a scale that you see here in the United States in terms of military equipment and capability. Again, this is a K-52. You can see it was brought down just outside of Hostomel Airport. You can see that it was armed with standoff, laser-guided anti-tank weapon systems. But if you look at the operation of these Russian helicopters around Hostomel Airport and compare and contrast what you would have seen with a U.S. attack helicopter unit, in all likelihood, you would not have seen American helicopters flying over Hostomel Airport, what were essentially strafing runs with the guns on these helicopters, trying to attack Ukrainian ground targets. No, the U.S. would have been many kilometers away from the airport. They would have been popping up, looking for targets, utilizing advanced sense and shoot processes in conjunction with drones that would have real-time sensory data on what was happening around the airport. And using that real-time sensory data, they would have been targeting Ukrainian military units around the airfield. Even before the arrival of these Russian assault units, the Ukrainian military units around Hostomel Airport would have been greatly degraded by precision fires, by precision-guided munitions coming from drones, coming from satellite-guided weapon systems being launched from aircraft many miles away from the theater of operations just around the airport. That's not what you saw from the Russians. You saw these Russian helicopters coming in doing strafing runs against Ukrainian forces, putting themselves at risk of being shot down. And indeed, some were shot down. And again, the Russians did not have the ability to clear out those Ukrainian forces, which eventually led to that Ukrainian counterattack that was able to disable the airfield. And even when the Russians did eventually seize control of the airfield, the ability to come in, repair the airfield, and then make that airfield operational, and again, this is two different issues. One is having the capability of bring in follow-on forces and make that airfield operational. And then two, more importantly, eliminate threats to that airfield. And that was just something that the Russians were not able to do. And that's part of the reason why you're seeing some of these Russian military bloggers think to themselves, well, maybe we need American generals. It's not the generals. It's technology and doctrine. Again, here's an interesting picture. So this is an American Ranger unit. An American Ranger unit that probably would have been used in the seizure of a Hostomel-like airfield. Now look, again, compare and contrast. What are you seeing? What's different? Maybe the Russians have night vision equipment that's stored in on themselves, on their person, on their kit. Maybe they have it. It's difficult to say. I don't see it there. And not only that, we see the Russians coming in during the daylight hours. That is something that the U.S. would have not have done as well. The optics on the rifles. I mean, there's a lot of things going on here that you'll probably see, and some of you will understand, some of you not so much. But this, in reality, is just a small piece of the puzzle. I don't think this is as big of a deal in terms of if you compare and contrast this U.S. unit to this Russian unit. Even with that kit, if the Russians had the ability to destroy Ukrainian forces around the airfield to prevent additional follow-on Ukrainian units from coming into the area of operations and shelling the airport. And what's interesting, I mean, we were in February, right? We were in late February, so a lot of the foliage was gone. If this was an American military operation, obviously the contrast in terms of the cold weather versus the heat of Ukrainian physical military equipment and personnel, that would have stood out like American firepower would have come to bear on those units, those Ukrainian units, in a significant way. And I don't think the Ukrainians would have been able to operate the way they did against Russian forces. Again, the Russians were just not able to bring enough firepower and enough sense and shoot capability to take out those Ukrainian units. And if they would have been able to do that. If they had adequate targeting pods, if they had real-time satellite information that was being used. It's difficult to say because we don't know what that capability for the Russians looked like that day. We assume that the Russians have a satellite capacity. We know they had a fairly rudimentary drone capacity, nothing even close to what the American military can field in terms of drones providing real-time sensory data and then having the ability to put weapon systems on target very quickly. And it was clear as day the Russians were not able to do that. And it was also very clear that the Ukrainians were being assisted by a vastly superior military force. And that was the Americans. That was the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, along with the U.S. military, that was feeding the Ukrainians real-time information. Hey, the Russians are coming from this location. It's this Russian military unit. The United States was feeding the Ukrainians that information. So the Ukrainians had a lot more information than they would ordinarily have if they were operating on their own. So that's a factor as well that you would have to consider when you compare and contrast the Russian inability to successfully take control of the airfield and bring on follow-on forces outside of a ground operation coming out of Belarus. And then finally, you have to look at doctrine. You have to look at what has existed for a very long time in the Soviet military and then finally into the Russian military. There are a lot of bad habits that are still being utilized by the Russians in terms of doctrine and methodology that was being used by the Soviets. I believe, and I look, again, not trying to offend anyone, Russians can be very stubborn. And I would say that what the Russians really need to kind of focus on and look inward on is the ability to and the desire to adapt and the ability to change. and the ability to look at new processes that would work for them. Now, again, there are definitely financial constraints. Absolutely. Glaringly apparent. But I do believe there's some key doctrine-related issues for the Russians. Specifically, I think the biggest, most glaring one is the ability to equip aircraft with advanced targeting pods. Could the Russians have adopted targeting pods that would have given them a better situational awareness of what was happening on the ground around Hostomel? Would they have had better ability to conduct long-range strike missions? And the answer to that is yes. There was a way to do that. And for whatever reason, the Russian General Staff, the Russian strategy thinkers decided against it. And in all probability, it has cost them the ability to launch some successful operations. And to this day, you can still see it. To this day, if you watch some of the footage that has been gained from the Ukrainian conflict, especially the use of Russian helicopters and fixed-wing Su-25s, you'll see those clips of the Russian aircraft coming in, pulling up, nose up, and then launching free flight rockets in the direction of a Ukrainian combat unit. That's just something that you would never see an American AH-64 Apache or any American aircraft ever do. I mean, the whole concept for an American Air Force, naval aviation, Marine naval aviation, utilizing free flight rockets other than rockets armed on an AH-64 Apache, and even those now we're going to more of an advanced laser guided kill system within those free flight rockets that are being used now. But you would never see an American aircraft launch rockets the way you see Russian aircraft launch rockets towards Ukrainian targets. And it's done for a couple of different reasons, right? One, they don't have the targeting pods. They don't have the advanced optronics to operate at a standoff distance. You occasionally you'll see them do it. They do have a limited capability for that, but by and large you don't see it a lot. The Su-24s, or I'm sorry, the Su-25s, yeah, Su-24s as well. Again, just the ability to sense and shoot and use standoff capability is definitely not present in some of these operations. They do have that capability, and you do see it from time to time, but not on the scale that you see it in the U.S. military, and it's a challenge for them. It's one of the primary reasons I believe that would make them more effective in military combat. Now look, again, the doctrine is designed to fight a large-scale conflict, a large-scale war. Now that obviously has fallen off quite a bit. Again, if you look at the doctrine that existed with the Soviets and fighting World War III, and that capability and the ability to mass produce huge amounts of tanks and artillery and field multi-million man armies, that doesn't exist right now. And again, that's coming from one doctrine to another doctrine, and the Russians are doing it. I think some of them are doing it kicking and screaming, but they're doing it, and they're gaining an understanding that technology is your friend. It is a force multiplier. You have to have it. Advanced technology. And that's what was missing, again, in some of these high-value targeting operations that the Russians have launched in this conflict. Now, some believe that the Russians went after Zelensky. Now, if they did, it wasn't successful. We possibly saw the deployment of Russian special operations forces into Kiev. We may have seen Ukrainian units in their incompetence fighting each other. And that's what created the thought that the Russians had tried to enter Kiev to seize Zelensky. It's tough to say right now. We could go either way on that. I mean, we definitely know that Ukrainian units engaged each other in Kiev. But did the Russians make a concerted effort to take out Zelensky? Did they know where he was at? Did they want to remove him? Tough to say. But what we do know is that the Russians wanted Kiev. I get it. I'm going to get the pushback from the Russian side, and that is, no, Kiev was a diversion. If we wanted Kiev, we would have taken Kiev. And I don't believe that. I think they tried. I think they tried to take Kiev, and it didn't work out. Again, for the reasons I just explained, in terms of what happened near Hostomel, the other airfield down to the southwest. There was talk about a Russian operation, an attempted Russian operation that took place to seize control of this airfield as well. Again, it's difficult to get a confirm on that. There were reports that a Russian transport aircraft or transport aircrafts were shot down on their way to this airfield. We just don't know. I believe they probably were not going to go after that airfield. I think, in all probability, that Hostomel was first. If Hostomel would have been successful and follow-on forces would have been successful, I'm not sure why they would have needed that airfield to the southwest. If Ukrainian forces started fleeing en masse and Russian ground strikes and the ability to engage and destroy Ukrainian ground units with aircraft and long-range strike systems, precision-guided strike systems, ballistic missile systems, utilizing real-time data on the positioning of Ukrainian forces. If that would have happened, it may have looked differently. But it didn't. It was largely ineffective for the Russians. Was it the whole idea that missiles were missing, or was it that Russian data in terms of knowing the exact position of Ukrainian troops was faulty? Hard to say. Maybe both. But that is why, if you compare and contrast what happened in Caracas, why that looked the way it did, again, a lot of it's technology. A very, very large component of it is technology. And then at the same time, yes, training. Do the Russians have a comparable unit, not just a comparable unit, but the support infrastructure that you would see with Delta or the Naval Development Group? Probably not. Well, not probably not. Most likely not. Most likely not. If you look at Russian, what you would call high-speed, low-drag, Tier 1 units, I mean, they exist, but again, it's different than what you're going to see. Not just if you compare skill set soldier to soldier. I would say that the Russians are there. It's the support capability that's not there for the Russians. The ability to destroy targets where those Tier 1 units don't have to fight a Ukrainian artillery battalion. That artillery battalion is destroyed before Tier 1 or high capability forces arrive. Hopefully that makes sense. Well, look, I think I've gone on long enough. More to come. As always, thank you for joining us. Good day.